drugs. But today, nowadays, it's much more than that. Addiction is very wide range and it invades every house, every home. Every one of us is threatened by some sort of an addiction. I'm standing here not as a, as a professional, but also as a potential addict, believe it or not, because everything around us drags us into becoming addicts one way or another. And the elephant in the room is what we call behavioral addictions, not drug addictions. Like I said, in the old days, the word addict signified a person that is maybe has certain characteristics that leads him into maybe the not very good upbringing, maybe the developing in a very not the best circumstances or parenthood or area. But right now, addiction involves every single person and it invades even our bedrooms. Why study addiction? Well, it's a disaster. It's a tornado that really circulates lives and uproots the person altogether. It begins very young in age and it can lead to severest forms of problems of all kinds. It can lead to death, it leads to mental illness. It can look exactly like mental illness. So a lot of emergency room visits would be related to addiction, and people would be labeled with mental disorders left and right, including severest forms like schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and none of that exists. It's only addiction, and these disorders can stick to that person forever, get them involved with many unnecessary treatments, admissions, and all kinds of treatments that can stay for life, while in fact the person doesn't have any of that. It can lead to medical problems. There's a lot of people, cocaine addicts, that can die from strokes, heart attacks. Heroin addicts that, well, heroin is not really life-threatening, but it feels like dying when they are getting off of it. And all kinds of other behavioral addiction leads to at least social kind of death. And spiritual, of course. It takes total control of people's lives, and that's why I chose the term tornado, because it circulates the entire aspects of life. I want to look at the definition, because the definition highlights certain areas that I want to emphasize. Those are the words written in red to give you a key. So the word compulsive means that it's out of control. There is a compulsion component. And then it emphasizes that it's either a substance or a behavior. Okay? And then it emphasizes that the person knows exactly how harmful it is. And not only how harmful it is, but it can cause death. So just by looking at that definition, what do you conclude when, in terms of how to treat a person or help a person who is an addict? What do you conclude of that? Any idea? If you want to help an addict, which attitude would you take based on that terminology or definition? Yeah.
I guess definitely not trying to convince them that it's wrong.
Very good. Why not?
Because apparently they know there's a theory.
Yeah, it's part of the definition that they know that it's wrong. Right. Very good. What else you don't do? Yes.
I was going to say you just kind of let them see that they can live without it. Like, because if it's an addiction, and they feel like they need it because they don't understand why they're doing it, then they just need to see but they can't live without it.
Okay. What else from the definition? Yes.
Leave it to the professional.
Give it to the professional because it's beyond just stopping, right? It's the word compulsive doesn't, it implies that it's beyond to just give a simple advice of stopping. You know, come on, stop smoking, this is dangerous. Come on, stop doing this behavior because it's taking your life. Well, it's beyond that, it's a compulsive, right? So just from the get-go, from the definition, we gather some information about how to deal with this person. And I'll give you an analogy here. If you are in a swimming pool and someone is drowning in a 5 feet, deep pool, would you stand out there and say, by the way, you're going to die? Doesn't make sense. Because that kills them by, from your words rather than from the fact that they're drowning. Because the last thing they need to know is that they are really actually sinking. They know they know they are sinking. So it's beyond just telling them that they are dying. And also, you don't stand out there and say it's, by the way, you can't swim, or come on, get out, or things of that nature, or you're wrong, or you're bad boy because you're drowning. All these kind of things we don't do. It needs a lot of, much more than that. The big question that leads to the message that I said in the beginning, the message is that whether this belongs to God in any way or is it belongs to science. That's the biggest question in the field. And if you pick any book about addiction from any library, you will either find one of those extremes. You most likely, you will, if you pick a scientific book, it will be taking the extreme of that this is all belongs to neurologists, psychiatrists, addiction specialists, and it has nothing to do with spirituality, it has nothing to do with Abuna or with God. And it's actually a pretty bad fight. Just listen to the National Institute of Drug Abuse head. It will be geared towards that this is science, get off you guys that say this is behavioral, get off that because it's destructive to say that. And this is all in the brain and it's a brain disease and you need to treat it as such. On the contrary, the other extreme, if you talk to a theologian, and you would have books about that. I have tons of books about addiction from church, and taking the other extreme. It has nothing to do with science. This is a God, return to God kind of situation. And what we need here is repentance. We need some saving grace to get that person out of the addiction. So let me ask you now, is it a sin or a disease? What do you think? Yes.
I think it starts off, it could start off as a sin.
Okay.
And lead to
Okay. That's the most common scenario. And why are you saying that, or somebody else? Why do you think that could be the situation? Why did you say that?
I was just thinking of physical drugs.
Yeah.
I was thinking of
Drugs or anything else?
drugs or like the normal things that we think of when it comes to addiction. When we choose that as our focus instead of choosing God, becomes something that we need, and then in turns our body then becomes like in need of it.
Yeah.
And that's what I try to do.
So very good. So it starts off as a choice, bad choice that can lead into loss of control due to damages that happen in the brain. I will go through that in a minute, but you can say that it starts off as that's the easiest answer to say it starts off as a sin and then it goes on to be a disease. But it actually interacts all through. Yeah, I agree with you, but it doesn't. It's not as simple as it is phrased like that. It continues to be a mix because the sin also is a chronic sin and the disease becomes a chronic disease. But then, what kind of disease are we talking about? Don't lose your focus. What kind of disease? Is it a physical, mental, psychological, spiritual, social? All of the above. Addiction develops as a tornado that circulates all these kinds of aspects around the person. So 4 components. You see that three circles: the body, the mind, and the spirit. All created by our Creator. Created our body, which has a brain that thinks and has emotions, what we call the mind, but also He breathed a soul into it that interacts with Him. So all these 3 spheres are created by God. God has to do with this, including the brain. That the science people are saying, oh, it's only a brain disease. Well, this brain is created by God. So the body, the mind, and the spirit, they all get affected. So 4 components of human life are the biology, which is the brain, kind of chemistry and physics, physical appearance and stuff. And then the psychological, which is the function of that brain, the mental function of that brain, the emotions, the thoughts and stuff. And then the social components, which is the behavior that brain leads us to behave. And then also the spiritual, which is like the sin, the disconnection from God. So it's a horrible disease. It's more than an answer of both. You can say, yeah, both. It's a sin and a disease, but it's more than that because that disease, that particular disease, is very complex. It includes the body, the mind, the social life, the spirit, everything. And that's why the image at the beginning, the tornado. Now, we go back to that image. What is the best thing to do to flee that? If you're living here, right here, and this is moving this way, what is the best thing you do? Run. It's not enough to wait until it circulates you and then starts to think how to deal with it. So the best treatment, or if that word, if that sentence applies, I don't think it applies, but if you will, the best way to deal with it is that you never fall into it. That's the best way. It's a hard thing to deal with. Very hard thing. But yet it's not impossible. So the conclusion is a complex bio-psychosocial spiritual disease and a sin. Okay? That's the conclusion of that. Really quick things that you already know. This half of the screen is chemicals. This half is behavior. The legalized stuff, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana, put it up now. So those are the legalized part. And then the illegal part, the cocaine, the heroin, the amphetamines, the hallucinogens, and the prescription drugs, which is the epidemic right now in the United States. We have an epidemic of prescription drug use that has led to tremendous amount of deaths among the youth, and it's not saving the Coptic youth. It's sad to say that I had experienced losses, tremendous amount of youth during the last couple of years to prescription drugs, maybe 10 to 15, ranging at the age of 30 to 40 or 20 to 40. But there is, like I said, the elephant in the room is the behavioral addiction. Pornography is at the top, sex addiction, gambling, even the little things like the internet, the TV, the video games, the food, and all of these kind of things are real. And they can cause changes in the brain, and they can cause even withdrawal kind of symptoms. And I would never forget that many years ago when His Grace Bishop Lee called me and to see someone in the car, and it turns out to be a video game addict who's in medical school and dropped out. And the family was like, they came to a point when they had to remove the guy off of the video games after he falls asleep with the food in his hand. After 10 to 15 hours a day of playing video games. And they had to lock up the video game thing in a closet. And the guy, that's when he got some withdrawal symptoms, mostly emotional withdrawal, psychological withdrawal. But it was real withdrawal, and that's when I got the call and when we saw him together. So it is very real, behavioral addictions and its impact on the brain. If you want to know how to prevent it, pay attention to these factors. When I say biological factors and I put some genes there, I don't mean that there is one gene that leads to addiction. There is no link to a gene that is called addiction. But the truth is that there are genetic predisposition. There are genetic mutations that happen that lead to people becoming more prone to be addicts. And that's proven scientifically, especially with alcoholism. But if it happens with alcoholism, because it's the most studied, it must be happening with everything else. And we believe that. There are people that are more prone to become addicts. But that does not mean they are doomed to become addicts. They can, with the grace of God, escape or flee that tornado. Psychological factors, pay attention to that picture, that guy, that image of somebody who's lonely and void from inside, void of love. Okay, that's a high risk for developing an addiction. Especially in our society, when we go to social part, our society the temptations are surrounding us very easily, and it's giving us a wrong conception of or understanding of freedom, and also the idea of a quick fix that we live in. Everything now is by buttons and even by talking and things happen, here in Manhattan, like the most developed area in the world, and everything needs to be done very on the tip of your fingers, very easily. God did not make us to be like that. God created us to live by doing things, contemplating His presence and receiving His grace and waiting on things to happen. And when we feel lonely or bored and we want to quickly fix that makes us prone to become addicts, dependent on things that have quick fix and get us out of that mindset or feelings. These are predisposing factors. Of course, dysfunctional fragmented families has part as well. So let me take you through a quick review of how this tornado develops from those four aspects. The biological, say with me, the biological, the psychological, and then the social, and the spiritual. How does that develop? The biological, I'm going to take you into a tour of medical knowledge way about this. The tornado of biological addiction starts by something called the first experience. You probably, as young professionals, know this stuff, so I'm going to go quickly. The first experience, and then it gives the person a high, and then goes to a state that we call abuse that develops into something called dependence. And that maybe explain what you said earlier, that the first experience considered like the choice of the sinful choice that we do, and then when we get that high and then it starts to continue in that sinful behavior, that we're still in the area of sin because we're abusing the creation rather than worshiping the creator. But then it develops, transitions into the dependence, which is what you said earlier, that we can't now, we're hooked, basically, and we can't, it becomes a physical disease. And we'll see how that works. So the first experience, you all know this stuff, either seeking a quick fix from a problem or trying to fit in with peers. Some people have difficulty in their social life and they want to feel sociable. It's very common. Or unintentionally with the prescription drugs. Now with the pain management, there are doctors that abuse that, and there are doctors that prescribe for pain, but then these little pill bottles are staying on the shelves to be picked up by other people. Or it's the same person have a knee problem or back problem and then gets flooded by prescription painkillers and then gets hooked. All of these are could be possibilities of how to start. Then the high comes, and the high is a function of the euphoric effect of that substance or behavior on the brain, and it depends on how fast that strength of a high that determines the degree of the addiction power of that substance or behavior. So things that cause very potent high and quick high are more addictive. And it has to do with a specific area in the brain that is called the reward circuit. And that's, again, I want to emphasize, this is God's creation, okay? So that's the difference here. The difference is that when this is going to be picked up by science people, they're going to forget God at all, put him aside, and now we're talking about an entity of whatever they want to call it. Mother Nature or something that created this, or this is biology, this is science, science is our God, and we're talking about science. But no, we have to remember that God has put this together, and there are so many verses that tells us. Psalm 116, I believe, or I forgot the number. There is 119. There is a psalm that says that I have put you together in the womb. I have formed you and connected your bones together and in the womb of your mother. So God has put this together, and the amazing way of God's creation in our cells and brains are beyond explanation. But let me tell you about this for now. This is a cross-section of the brain. Each area of the brain has a function, as you see, and this one in the middle, right in the core of our brains, it's called the reward circuit. And it's pleasure centers. He has put cells in the brain that has no other function other than receiving pleasure. God did that because he wants us to have pleasure in him, in connecting with him. So the church father says that he fashioned our bodies, and God put the soul inside of this body to worship him. And we say that in the Tasbihah. There's a verse in the second host Lopsh, or Tafsir, that says, he made man in his likeness and image, that he may praise him. that he may praise him. So from that verse you understand that the church fathers understood very early on that God has made this brain in his likeness and image, meaning rational mind, a mind that has authority, a mind that has freedom, only to worship him. So he put this pleasure centers in there for a reason, and he put us up like this, upright. We are the only creation that is put upright like this out of the animal kingdom. Right? All the animals are looking down. We are put up like this. Our brain is high there to worship him. So he gave us this mind to praise him, connect with him. He gave us the intelligence to feed on his word. He gave us our emotions to love him, to feel loved by him. He gave us our willpower to submit to his will in our lives. Okay? These pleasure centers go from very deep inside of the brain. Here is the brain stem that has the reflexes that we share with insects, right? The reflexes. Here is the nucleus accumbens, which is the emotional part of us that we share with higher level animals. And here is the prefrontal cortex that we share with humans. The intellectual, the more sophisticated human beings have prefrontal cortex with decision making. So you can see the pleasure center that takes all the brain and connects the brain. And that's the area that gets affected with addiction. That's where the tornadoes start. So when the person takes that pill or drinks that cup or uses any behavior like sexual behavior or looking at something, it hits these centers, right? But it hits it in an abnormal way, using a chemical called dopamine. That hijacks that area. It hijacks. So look at what the dopamine is. The dopamine is in these vesicles up there, and it should be released to be connected with the other neuron, like here, from one neuron to the other. But look what the cocaine or any other substance does. It replaces it. So this is the green thing, it's like the cocaine, and instead of the dopamine, it replaces it, and it connects with those receptors in the brain, and it gives a high. And look at the chemical that is used to give the high. It's called dopamine. Okay, so is that boring? Okay, are you connected with me? Okay, so this circuit has receptors, and it has dopamine vesicles that is released. Okay, and this dopamine, when it connects, it gives a pleasurable feeling, and then it stamps in the brain and memory. We call it an emotional memory, that this thing that you just did is very likable. Do it again. That's called the reward. That's called the pleasure. Allah, God has made this for us to connect with Him. When we do tasbihah, see guys, when they do tasbihah, they get excited, right? And you see the monks, they spend like hours. You see St. Paula and Babola, 70 years in a cave. He was not bored. The pleasure circuit was fantastically working. It was connecting with Him. Yeah.
So is our relationship to God supposed to resemble an addiction?
Yes, it's the healthy addiction. Yes. So that's a very good question, because I want to coin that term. I want to coin that addiction is a phenomena that God had set for Him. He put in place some circuit for us to get hooked to Him. Okay? But if you read Romans chapter 1, he tells you this. The problem with those Gentiles, he was addressing the Gentiles. The problem with the Gentiles, they didn't hear about God. So they had a nature, by nature, something telling them God exists. Look at the sky. Look at the environment. He exists. He's so beautiful. But when they knew Him, instead of worshiping Him and thanking Him, they fell into worshiping themselves. And St. Athanasius describes this process by leaving the Creator and looking down into the creation and starting to worshiping it. So he put in a system to be addicted to Him, but we put Him aside and we got that same system to be addicted to material. Okay? So look at the normal thing. But let me add something. He put this system to use it in relationship with Him, and also to use it in connecting with His creation, but from His hands. In other words, He put pleasure centers for us to be pleased by normal eating from His hand, and by normal sexual relationship in marriage from His hand and blessing, from normal pleasurable activities from the creation, but relating it to Him by thanksgiving and using the creation from His hand. Read the book by Father Alexander Schmemann, titled The Life of the World, which is God sanctifying the world for us as it was before sin. It was sanctified because He created this whole world for us, but not to take the world and leave Him. It makes a big difference. If we put Him aside and we start using the world, then we're going to get addicted to the creation rather than Him. So, how does that translate to science? Look at this screen. This is the normal increase of dopamine when you eat, from 100 unit to 150 unit. But this is the way of increase of dopamine in your brain when you use a drug, like amphetamine. It's going from 100 to 1,000 to 1,100 in a few minutes. That's not a godly use of the brain circuit, the pleasure circuit. I'm talking about the brain cells that I showed you, the pleasure brain cells, the circuit. The release of dopamine should be natural, like this, with food, sex, or whatever, normal sex in marriage. But when someone is addicted to sex, or addicted to pornography, or addicted to amphetamines, or addicted to cocaine or heroin, you may name it. It's a different way it's an abusive way of the release of this dopamine. Yes?
When you mentioned when the release of the dopamine, and you mentioned you get saved in the memory, this is like a good feeling that you want to do it again.
Right.
But I also said it's compulsive behavior that, it has negative effect. How does the mind work this out if it kind of creates a cognitive dissonance? Like, it's good, it saves us good, but it's also bad, but this is like, this cognitive dissonance, right? Like,
Yes,
that
that develops later when in the phase of dependence. The compulsion part, compulsive word, comes in the last phase of the phases of addiction that I used and described. I said the first use, right, which is I'm still in, and then the abuse, and then goes to the dependence. So bear with me, and I will answer that scientifically now. So that's the idea that the first use will release an exaggerated reaction of dopamine release, and then it becomes to the brain that's kind of the normal now, because if you're used to 1,100 units of dopamine from a use, or you tasted that and you want it again, now introduce something like that that gives you only like a 50 units increase, and it doesn't touch you, right? So your brain gets used to that abnormal euphoria, right? And that's what explains that the addict goes into that dilemma of disconnecting from everything, and nothing now makes any pleasure. The phase of the abuse is when the person starts to do this more and more and more, even with hazardous things happening, physical hazards, failure, major roles like work, home, or school, recurrent legal problems, social problems, interpersonal problems, all of these start to, the person doesn't care. He just wants to do this more and more. That's still in the abuse. Then happens something that transitions into the compulsion. It's called neuroadaptive changes. What is neuroadaptive changes? It's when the brain starts to rebel against the person. Imagine that the brain is a person talking to the person, to the owner. Imagine with me, Kira, the brain of that person is starting to say, no, stop, you're abusing me. The brain wants to shout to that person who's pouring this dopaminergic effect on him, and the brain is not created for that. So the brain starts to adapt. How does the brain adapt? Yes?
I was going to ask, when does it start to shout? Does it shout like while the dopamine is being poured in, or is it when the mind is finally cleared of the drug or whatever it may be, does it begin to like negotiate with itself?
No, it's a biological process, regardless of what's the state of that mind. It's a biological process that God has put in place, just like the development of the skin when you it's an adaptive biological process. Let's say someone who's working in the mines and the stones and stuff, the skin starts to thicken. Why? Because it's adapting to that kind of work. So I'm just using that analogy of the brain independently shouting back, because it just highlights how that the brain wants to adapt to this abnormal use and abnormal amount of dopamine. And the way it does that is that it shuts down the receptors. Remember the image of the receptors I showed you before? These receptors here? So let's say this is a neuron, which it is, and has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dopamine receptors in that one neuron, right? And supposedly, normally, those 5 receptors get triggered by the dopamine connecting to them. But then when this man is pouring like 100-folds of the amount of dopamine, the brain, the only way to deal with this is to shut down some of those receptors. So the brain cells start to kick one after the other and leaves only one for that person. Why? Because you don't need that all dopamine. Okay, you pour dopamine, I'll take away the receptors. I'll keep one receptor from each cell instead of 10. Right? And that is a physical change that happens in the brain. And what that causes is 2 things. One is called tolerance, which means that now that the person is pouring, like let's say, 10 cups of alcohol, or 10, what they call the cups, or drinks. 10 drinks of alcohol a day, right? But no longer it gives them the high. Why? Because the brain has decided to cut down on the alcohol receptors. So now I don't feel it. So what do?
More.
They drink more, drink 10 times more.
So God designed the body biologically to
Yes,
stop it,
yes.
but we just keep adding more.
We're just adding more and getting ourselves destroyed more. And now there is a physical problem in the brain. But not only the tolerance, there is another problem called withdrawal. And that happens when, let's say this guy, now an alcoholic, dependent alcohol dependence, gets into a motor vehicle accident and gets admitted to the hospital unconscious. Now nobody knows that he's an alcoholic, right? So he's unconscious. That doesn't stop the brain from being adapted to the alcoholism for years, right? The brain only have one receptor now called GABA receptor for alcohol. So all of a sudden, there is no tons of alcohol poured, right? For years, this man has been drinking and drinking and increasing and drinking and increasing, pouring alcohol on the brain, and now what? No alcohol. He's unconscious in the hospital, right? Nobody's going to give him alcohol there. What happens to the brain? The brain now not only needs one receptor, but or even normal, the 10, they need more, because that is like drought. There is no alcohol whatsoever after 10 years of giving that brain 10 times stimulation. Now there is nothing. So the brain goes into a vigorous demand of alcohol. A vigorous demand. Not normal, but 10 times more. Because there is only one receptor to be stimulated, and there is nothing to stimulate that one receptor. That's called withdrawal. Withdrawal symptoms is physical disease. So now it's a disease. It's definitely a disease. It's a brain disease. Now, my initial message, you remember it? What was my initial message? Yeah, God created the brain. This, having said that it's a brain disease like this, but yet we can't say that the fix is only going to be medical, because there is also a lack of finding of the Creator, connection to the need of the fulfilling this brain. So let's go back to I'm just reminding you of that message over and over again. The neuroadaptive changes were proven. They put a cocaine addict in something called a machine, fancy machine, PET scan, positron emission tomography. It's a scan that measures the blood supply in the brain cells to see how viable it is. And they put a normal person here and a cocaine addict here. The normal person had blood supply, the reddish areas all over the brain, but the cocaine addict was determined to have tissue that is fibers, this yellow fibers. The brain has physically deteriorated. So we have proof that that addiction is a brain disease. And also, not only the brain, the smoker's body is almost disappeared in this one. Here, this is a smoker body, and you can see that how it's almost blackened. Almost all the organs are destroyed by nicotine. Nicotine, by the way, is not a child at the feet. It's a huge monster. Nicotine is very addictive and very destructive. It's the silent killer. Okay, so the dependence phase clinically is described here. There is tolerance, withdrawal, taking larger amounts, persistent desire, much time and activity so basically the drug or this behavior is the center of that person's life. That person, like instead of like what we aim for, which is becoming God-centered or Christ-centered person, that person becomes alcohol-centered, sex-centered, this-centered. It becomes the center that this person's life rotates around. It becomes a God. A God. It's a replacement for God. There's no, it's point blank. It's a replacement of God. God created us to live by Him. Remember St. Paul when he went to Athens and he found them putting the thing and saying unknown God, and he said, I know this God. He's the Creator. به نحيا ونتحرك ونوجد. through him we live. I'm going to translate. Bihi nahya, with him we live. Nataharak, we move. And nuga, we exist. So by him we live, move, and exist. By him. But in the addiction mind, it is by that substance that we move and exist, and that's why we're here. We circulating around that. That's just a diagram to illustrate what happens, what I just said. Normally, that's the brain settled with GABA receptors. When you do alcohol, you fill these GABA receptors like this. Alcohol, 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 and then the brain kind of rebels and adapts, so tilts that like that to normalize things by adapting, by cutting on the receptors, and retains balance again. But with the alcohol, okay. So instead of with God here, you're balanced. That person is balanced with alcohol. And then when you cut alcohol, you stay with the adaptation. The adaptation in the brain stays and it tilts back, which is what we call withdrawal. And then when we start to treat that person, we start to deal with this brain that is adapted, and that's the hardest.
Do you have diagrams that show how the brain is physically impacted by behavioral addictions? Like, is it also the same effect, or is it not?
Behavioral addiction, that's very good questions. Behavioral addictions are new phenomena in the field of addiction. Not relatively new, not very new, but relatively new. But where I practice in the University Hospital in New Jersey, the head of that department, Dr. Livonis, he is specialized in behavioral addiction. He wrote a book about behavioral addiction that was just released a couple of years ago. So when I met him, I got that book. I read it because Bishop Karas wanted me to present another topic about behavioral addiction per se, because that's what really affects the youth. And to my surprise, that all the behavioral addiction, yes, it does that, these changes in the brain, but the treatment is all spiritual. In the book, in the scientific book, not the church opinion, it's the science opinion that how to get over behavioral addiction is the 12-step program. And if you look at the 12-step program, it's a typical program of an Orthodox Christianity. I will share a few slides at the end with that. Any other questions? Yes.
For the post-acute withdrawal, does it ever get balanced, or will always be slanted? And
Yeah, like you say, we do our best chemically, but it almost never comes back the same.
The person has a potential for relapse.
Of course, huge potential for relapse. Of course. The tolerance and sensitivity. This is a phenomenon that I want to explain because it has to do with why people overdose. So overdose with opioid addictions. Opioid is the substance that is present in the painkillers and morphines and heroin. Okay. This is the epidemic that I mentioned. And this is why people die out of overdose, accidental overdose. I'm not talking about suicide overdose. You get that, right? You understand what I mean? There's a difference between I take an overdose suicidal, and that I end my life accidentally while using drugs. So that's what we're talking about, the accidental overdose. Those are the ones that are staggering rates. And those are the ones that I mentioned that even our youth are affected with, accidentally. Okay, so how does that happen through this? I'm not going to read all of this, but I'm going to explain them. Tolerance and sensitization are two different things opposite each other. Tolerance, I already explained. You start giving the substance and the brain gets used to it, and you need more to get the same effect. But the sensitization is the opposite. When there are cells, خليكم معايا عشان تعرفوا ازاي الاوفردوز بيحصل. How does the overdose happen and why? When the brain, some other cells get sensitized by using, it becomes more responsive. Opposite to the tolerance. The tolerance is that with more use, it gets less stimulated and you need more. But the sensitization is with more use, it gets more stimulation. So with opioids, it has two different rules. One, on the opioid receptors, which is tolerance. It asks for more opioids to get the same high. But on the back here, on the respiratory center, it gets sensitized. So the more you use, the respiration gets depressed. So put the two together, the brain asks for more to get the same high, while your respiratory center is asking for less because it's getting depressed. While the person doesn't understand that, doesn't know. All what he does is that he needs more to get high, but the more he gets high, the more the respiratory center is a CNS is depressing. Is it clear? And then once he keeps going high, to a certain point when the respiratory center stops. That's accidental overdose. Okay? Add to this that they cheat in the streets. Instead of selling heroin, they sell something called fentanyl because it's cheaper, but it's 10 times potent or 70 times more potent than heroin. 70 times. So you can take a bag of heroin thinking that you use the 10 bags or whatever every day, but it's cheated. It's fentanyl, which is 70 times more potent. So suddenly it stops the respiratory center and they die. The craving is what somebody here mentioned that, or I think it was you when you said that he keeps imbalance and he asks for it. There's a potential, the craving, potential, and this memory that was stamped fires with any memory, people, places, and things. The people that the person is using that drug or behavior with, the places that they go, and the things. So that was the biological part. The psychological part is this circle here. People go into stress, start to think about using, get obsessed about using, then starts to compulsively go and indulge, then feel guilty, feel denial, and they go in a psychological circle. The social tornado is that the person attempts to hide the addiction from family and friends, which leads to dishonesty and guilt. Lying is part of addiction, unfortunately. And that's when the sins are compiling in each other, right? So even though, yes, now I do this compulsively, but I have to lie to survive. To dishonesty and guilt, becoming withdrawn, difficult to reason with, because the mind is focused on something else always. Strange behavior when you're either on or off the drug or the behavior. More use leads to guilt, leads to depression, sacrifice of personal integrity, relationships, jobs, keeps losing things. Addiction becomes the center of the person's life, and everything goes downhill. That's the social sad story. The spiritual part was described by St. Paul in Romans chapter 7, and also in St. James 1:14. Each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And when the desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and the sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. So it's a process. But St. Paul describes, again, when you read this passage, you feel like St. Paul is an addict. If I don't tell you that this is St. Paul, you wouldn't believe it. You would think that this is an addict. He basically says, I'm doing things that I don't want to do, and something inside of me is making me do things that I hate, and I can't control it. I can't stop. What a wretched man I am. That's what he's saying. And he's describing humanity without God. It's what St. Athanasius wrote in his book, The Incarnation of the Word, that humanity lost the image, lost the Word of God that lives by. And humanity started to be addicted to desires and self, became darkness. St. Paul says one sentence in the end of chapter 7 as a solution. I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord, because that's why God incarnated. That's why He came to fix it. He came to bury this old man, the wretched man he became hooked to material, buried him in baptism, and gave a new man. And then he wrote chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 is the triumph, the victory. It's the most beautiful chapter in the whole, to me, it's my favorite, most powerful chapter. Romans chapter 8, I think it does a homework. It's the freedom in Christ. They call it the Holy of Holies of the New Testament. By living by the freedom of the Spirit, which is what we should be celebrating in the Holy 50s, by the way. In the Holy 50s, we celebrate that Christ conquered everything, victorious. Now He's resurrected. So no matter where we were in Him,